If people today remember the name of Kate Brownlee Sherwood, it is probably due to one of her poems, Molly Pitcher, which describes how at the Battle of Monmouth, after an American artilleryman fell wounded, Molly Pitcher sprang to his side, fired as she saw her husband do, telling the king in his stubborn pride, women like men to their homes are true. Molly for her work is recognized as the heroine of the day. Washington rode from the bloody fray, up to the gun that a woman manned. Molly Pitcher, you saved the day, he said, as he gave her a hero's hand. He named her a sergeant with manly praise, while her war-brown face was wet with tears. A woman has ever a woman's ways, and the army was wild with cheers. The remembrance of Molly did not end with Sherwood's poem. A small but impressive litany to her memory has run throughout American history. In 1859, for example, J.C. Armitage, an English engraver, wrought an engraving of Molly hard at work at the cannon, and sometime between 1956 and 1904, Currier and Ives produced a lithograph, also showing Molly with her cannon. In the 20th century, Molly's legend reached its apogee. In 1928, to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Monmouth, 10 million 2-cent stamps, which featured Washington's profile, were embossed with the name Molly Pitcher, as a compromise since Postmaster General Harry New refused to commemorate Molly Pitcher or Monmouth specifically with their own stamp. In World War II, the SS Molly Pitcher, a Liberty-class cargo ship, was commissioned and torpedoed in 1943, and in 1978, for the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Monmouth, Molly was finally given her own stamp. So prominent has Molly been in the American imagination that the woman or women behind her have largely been forgotten. While some maintain that the legend of Molly Pitcher has absolutely no truth to it, that does not seem to be the case. It is fairly certain that at Monmouth there was a woman present, Mary Ludwig Hayes McCauly. She was probably born in 1754, although her birthday is still ambiguous. At around 15, she married John Hayes of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, who, at the commencement of the Revolution, became an artilleryman, first in Thomas Proctor's 1st Company of Pennsylvania Artillery, and then in 1777 in the 7th Pennsylvania Regiment. Sometime prior to Monmouth, Mary joined her husband's regiment as a camp follower, washing, cooking, and caring for the sick, as patriotic women were wont to do. As Ida Cohen Sullivan says in Nurses in the American History, the Revolution, there were no professional nurses at the time of the Revolution, and many women became the unofficial mothers of the army, a way they could support the cause. The story goes that Mary received the name Molly Pitcher from carrying water to the troops in the heat of battle at Monmouth, Molly being a nickname for Mary, and that when her husband fell from a wound or from heat exhaustion, she not only cleaned his cannon but began firing it as well. After the Revolution and her second husband's death, Mary worked as a charwoman, and on February 21st, 1822, she was awarded $40 yearly from the Pennsylvania legislature for, quote, her services in the Revolutionary War, unquote. As Ellen E. Dodge briefly says in her entry about Molly Pitcher in Profiles of Revolutionaries in Atlantic History, 1700 to 1850, the wording of the act gives validation to the legend, as the legislature awarded Mary her reward for her own services, and not simply for being the widow of a Revolutionary veteran, as the act originally read. There are, however, difficulties with the legend. It is true that no one associated Mary Ludwig Hayes McCauly with Molly Pitcher until 1876, when residents of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where Mary died and was buried, arranged to have a stone inscribed with the name Molly Pitcher placed over her grave. In 1905, a cannon, flag, and flagstaff were added, and in 1916 a monument was placed over her grave, much to the chagrin of Charles Zemer, the editor of Carlisle's American Volunteer, who had campaigned against the monument. And while Mary may have provided services of her own at Monmouth, there is no record that Washington made her a sergeant, as a later edition of the legend in Sherwood's poem claim. Also, Mary's legend as Molly Pitcher seems to have been crossed with another historical ghost, Margaret Corbin, who was also with her husband, this time at the Battle of Fort Washington in 1776. Unlike Mary Ludwig, Margaret Corbin was permanently disabled, losing the use of one of her arms from grape shot after she fought in her husband's post at the event of his death in battle. In fact, Margaret actually became a member of the Invalid Regiment in 1777. After 1783, when the Invalid Regiment was disbanded, no hard trace of Margaret can be found, though she was identified with Captain Molly, who lived in the area of West Point and later Highland Falls, New York. The confusion between Mary and Margaret seems to have come from Benson J. Lossing, who mistakenly identified, quote, the famous Irish woman known as Captain Molly, unquote, with Mary Ludwig in his pictorial field book of the Revolution, which was published in 2 volumes in 1851 and 1852. So who is the real Molly Pitcher? Well, the answer to that question will probably never be known due to the lack of documentation, facts, and just the growth of mythology around the character. But becoming focused on the who seems in my mind to lose sight of the larger point. Much like King Arthur, a real man swallowed up by the mythology of what he represents, Molly Pitcher is important for what she represents. Many women, like Mary and Margaret, aided in the Revolution as cooks and nurses and mothers, providing a great service that perhaps only a few men felt. It is impossible to honor them all, and this impossibility should not lead to the conclusion that none of the heroes of the Revolution, even the ones well documented and known, such as Washington and Greene and Adams and Carroll, should not be honored for the sake of fairness. Through Molly Pitcher, all the women who sacrificed in whatever way for the cause of American independence can be honored. And in that sense, Molly Pitcher is important, not just for the American Revolution, but also for the American imagination.